Dark magic. Sometimes it's the handiwork of an evil cult. Sometimes it's connected to an obscure branch of arcane knowledge. And other times it's a metaphor contrasting the straightforward faith of light magic against science gone so far that it hits zombies. Whatever it happens to be in any given setting, dark magic always gets a bit more thought put into it than any of the other Fire Emblem tome types, as befits a kind of magic known for its secondary effects and limited access among the playable cast. Longtime fan of clerical-themed fantasy classes though I may be, I don't begrudge the bad guys always getting cooler stuff. That's just how these things work out. So then, how about dark magic in Fodlan? On the surface, the answer is simple. Analysis of class outfits, the symbols that appear when casting, or even just basic association will tell you right away that dark magic in this setting is affiliated with those who slither in the dark, who I'm going to refer to as the Agarthans for the rest of this video because it's way less of a mouthful. Sorry, Hubert, your name for them sucks. Anyway, though, they're roughly the fourth shadowy cult in Fire Emblem history to be used as the source of dark magic, so that's nothing special. What is special, however, is the handful of characters who can wield dark magic, and what it can tell us about what the developers had in mind when they were putting together spell lists. Across both 3 houses and 3 hopes, there are 8 characters in the roster who can use dark magic. Edelgard, Hubert, Lysithea, Euritza, Happy, Shez, Monica, and Arval. The most common thematic element here is quite obvious, and it ties right back into the Agarthans. Edelgard, Lysithea, Happy, and Monica were all captured by Fodlan's resident EDM mole men at one point or another, with at least 3 of them having been subjected to different types of magical experimentation. They even get a Scarlet Blaze paralogue to themselves that's all about revisiting that subject. The Agarthan connection for Shez and Arval is also self-explanatory. Arval flat out is one of the cult via some weird reincarnation shenanigans, and Shez is their current vessel in the physical world. Not an entirely consensual arrangement, but Shez would have died otherwise, and it's supposed to contrast Byleth and Sothis, so whatever. That just leaves 2 more dark magic users. Euritza's only dark spell is Death, which is perfectly on brand for the alternate personality that he pushes his murderous bloodlust onto. His scythe is an Agarthan weapon, but aside from that, Euritza doesn't have any explicit connection to them. He's kind of like a co-worker in a different department. He might indeed have a traumatic history to back up his one dark spell, but it's one where he has all the agency. In fact, one reading of the Death Knight persona is that it's Euritza's subconscious attempt at absolving himself of responsibility for murder. And then there's Hubert. Hubert is absolutely one of my favorite Fodlan characters, but I'll be the first to admit that he's easier to explain in concept than in in-universe execution. In their efforts to creatively borrow from Genealogy of the Holy War, Intelligent Systems must have figured that if Edelgard was going to be Arvis, then she'd need a Manfroy. They were so generous that they gave her 2 Manfroys, and naturally, they hate each other. Hubert's design is lifted from that of earlier evil sorcerers like Izuka and Iago, only adjusted to be slightly less hideous so that someone might theoretically want to S-rank him. I bring that up because, when you get down to it, there's strangely not much of anything to say about Hubert as a dark mage as they're established in the world of Fodlan. He's got the look and the spell list, but in all the pages and pages of character dialogue in both these games, there's not a single reference that I've ever seen as to why Hubert uses dark magic. At most, there are opportunities for headcanons. Maybe the dark magic ties into how people without crests supposedly struggle more with magic, and that therefore it's Hubert's way of getting around that limitation. His magic growth is noticeably higher than fellow non-crested mages Dorothea and Manuela, and in fact ties or surpasses most of the game's mages who do have crest. Maybe those spells are a sign that he's really an Agarthan, Or maybe he's just a huge fan of Agarthan magic and tech and wants to take them all for himself after he's gotten Talez out of the way. Meyer especially pairs well with his toxic presence and methods of dealing with his enemies. And until Three Hopes, the spell was entirely unique to him among the playable cast. Or maybe it's much simpler than that, and the developers really did just want to give us a playable Manfroy and didn't think too much about what that might do to the world building. Because there are definitely some uncomfortable implications once you really get into the world building. And for that, we're going to have to talk about echoes for a minute. Shadows of Valentia is often criticized for its writing, especially the decision to double down on the misogyny typical of the Kaga games. A standout example of this would be the handling of the Duma Faithful, Valentia's own dark magic cult. The men of the Faithful seemingly belong to the organization of their own free will, or at least nothing is ever made of their membership, and they're allowed to be exactly the types of two-dimensional villains you'd expect them to be. The women of the Duma Faithful, on the other hand, are unwillingly sacrificed to their god and reborn as witches totally enthralled to Duma and to the rest of his followers. This nearly happens to main character Celica in one of the remake's most hated story changes. The plight of Valentia's witches additionally got some recent coverage a few months ago in Fire Emblem Heroes, with Ascended Sonia being added to the game alongside her two sisters who'd been turned into witches by their father. It goes without saying that this is all pretty messed up, but amidst all of FE15's other problems and general absence of hype compared to the non-remake modern games, it flies under the radar pretty easily. You can understand, though, why I'd be bringing it up here, because the setup of the Duma Faithful is eerily similar to what we see with Fodlan's dark magic users. Men wield the Agarthan's power apparently of their own free will, and with both Hubert and Yuritsa, there's the distinct sense that they're doing so for the aesthetic, to be the hammy evil sorcerer and the death-wielding Death Knight that they're so obviously designed as. The women, though, are handed these tragic backstories that tie their dark magic use into past trauma and the violation of their bodies, often leaving them with crippling side effects. This even carries over into gameplay. In both Three Houses and Three Hopes, all male characters can opt into Dark Mage and Dark Bishop, dressing up like Agarthans and learning the basic miasma spell for as long as they're in those classes. This is true no matter how silly or out of character it would be. How about a Dark Mage Sedeth, or Dimitri? Female characters, however, have no way of acquiring dark magic unless they learn it from their own spell list, outside of two Hopes exclusive options, the unintuitive and RNG-dependent peer training system, or the relic tome Hoti, which would also require them to equip one of the crest items in New Game Plus to let them use Dark Spikes, since only Happy naturally carries the corresponding crest. That's dedicating 2 whole equipment slots, or relying on peer training with its 8% chance of activation at best, to gain access to a magic type that male characters can get simply from the class unlock screen. Now, you may notice here that I've avoided bringing up Shez and Arval as much as possible. This is because, as with several other things involving Fire Emblem avatars, the gender variability of these characters makes them difficult to account for in a way that makes sense in-universe. If Shez is female, then she's yet another victim of Agarthan bodily invasion like all the rest. If Shez is male, then he's an exception that proves the rule, because he has to share a script with a female character. And even then, male Shez can still access the dark magic classes where his female counterpart can't, and so voluntarily lean more into that Agarthan angle if he chooses. This even, illogically, applies to Arval as well, whose gender always matches Shez, and who therefore sometimes can't be a dark mage despite actually being an Agarthan. Looking outside the playable roster, the only non-generic female mage among the Agarthans is Cornelia, and she's little more than a riff on Echo's conversion of Nui Baba into a standard evil sorceress type like Awakening's Aversa. There is that one peculiar line in Scarlet Blaze that caught everyone's attention, But if that's not a clumsy translation mistake, then the implications of it are absolutely awful given the character we're talking about here. Let's just call it a mistranslation and move on. But why does any of this matter? Realistically, it doesn't. Much like the majority of dark magic lore in the other Fire Emblem settings, these characters' traumas are largely cordoned off into optional support lines and paralogs. Even when you'd think that Edelgard's victimization at the hands of the Agarthans would factor into the main plot, both games find ways to make that not really ever be a thing whenever she's playable. And when she's not playable, it's only ever used to generate a more dramatic final boss, or undercut any responsibility she might have for that whole war she started on account of her now being brainwashed and manipulated by flat villains who also happen to be older men and... yeah. This isn't the first time that I brought up the fetishistic undertones of Azure Gleam's ending, and how it plays exactly into IS's standard treatment of its major female characters. Since then, we've even gotten an entire book of heroes that does exactly the same thing with several of its original characters, and with even less attempt to play coy about it. Male Fire Emblem characters are never objectified in this way, not even when they're placed in similar narrative circumstances. Leon might fall to the Demon King, and Takumi might get killed and possessed in Conquest, but you'll never see the camera lovingly lingering on an upskirt shot for them. If you really want to get down even further into it, while it's never tied directly into their dark magic use, both Hubert and Yuritsa's backstory baggage hinges on their reactions to the trauma suffered by the women in their lives. Hubert rationalizes murdering his father by recounting the man's role in the insurrection of the Seven and Edelgard being taken into Fargus, whereas Yuritsa goes on his first murderous rampage after he learns that Baron Bartels intends to use Mercedes to give him a crest baby. Once again, the writing creates a situation where men are allowed to act, which in these cases translates to murder, while women remain passive victims. And while violent reactions to trauma are certainly not limited to these characters in the Fodlan games, the unique parallel here represented by dark magic use really underlines the disparity. This is the real problem that I wanted to call attention to here, because in the years of heated discourse surrounding the Fodlan games, I feel it's something that goes ignored more often than it should. There are many criticisms that can be made about misogynistic writing in older Fire Emblem games. It's all over the place, and it was being discussed among fans who identified this sort of thing long before the likes of Noe and Camilla, and certainly before this franchise got a mobile gacha. Fire Emblem is about as male gaze dominated as a Nintendo IP is ever going to get, but what always made it stand out, for me at least, is that the fan service elements were often so over the top that you just had to laugh at them if it's not something you're into. Or otherwise, they're referencing such taboo interests that they operate more as shock value than as actual fetish bait. The modern games, though, make no secret of the fact that their female characters are commodities being sold to players. And Three Houses in particular tones down the over-the-top premises and risque outfits just enough to fool some people into believing that IS isn't prioritizing their most lucrative demographic of gacha whales. Because like it or not, the fan service is paying off well for them. Golvag won Choose Your Legends last year at a time when she was nothing more than a busty villain erotically teasing the player's self-insert. And popular female characters of the Fodlan games are constantly being repackaged for consumption just like those of the other settings. It really stinks to know that these characters could be vastly more interesting than what they're made out to be. Lysithea, for example, has a magical setup I'd normally adore, the rare combination of light and dark that I'd hoped to see with the Yune-blessed Micaiah back in Radiant Dawn. But what her writing pushes most for her is the Agarthans violating her body and reducing her lifespan for their experiments, and only with the help of you, the player, can she live a long and fulfilling life of being sweets-obsessed jailbait. It's not all that different from Edelgard. who needs you to reach for her hand, and who continues to remain at her most marketable not as an imposing emperor with agency and drive, but rather as a cute young woman in short skirts crushing on her teacher. Happy's a bit better off, thanks in part to more limited screen time, and there it is. There's the inexplicably horny. Ugh, I don't want a waifu, I want an actual character. And make no mistake, all that overt pandering also undercuts the weight of these characters' trauma. Why should I really care that Lysithea and Happy wield dark magic because they were permanently scarred by vile underground experiments, when Hubert, Yuritsa, and literally any other male character with a dark seal can use the exact same spells for no greater reason than because they want to? Like Three Hopes turning Monica into an extended lesbian joke at her own expense, or Three Houses being so lazy at narrative integration that you can count the number of times Edelgard's siblings are referenced on one hand. This all speaks to the writers not actually caring all that much about their own world building, and just rehashing stale ideas from past games about how to ensure that female characters remain sympathetic and marketable even when they're affiliated with a villainous faction. You can't help but want more for these characters, that they could be allowed the same range of expression as their male counterparts, and didn't need to have all the uglier parts of their stories centered around needing a self-insert to save them. And anyway, all that effort is obviously wasted on me. If Hubert's any indication, all IS needs to do to make a dark mage I like is to make him hammy and evil and give him some amusing subtext with another guy. But of course, I'm fairly well outside their target demographic. I don't spend any money on heroes, for starters. But whether you're in that demographic or not, what do you think about the way that the Fochlin games handle dark magic? Tell me about it in the comments, and leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it. I've got more videos like these planned throughout 2024, covering various topics of interest to me. Not just about Three Houses, but about other games in the series as well. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on those. Au revoir!